Hello friends, this is the third lecture of our adrenal cortex series. Let's get started. Transport of cortisol. Now 90% of the cortisol is in bound form. Out of that, first protein with which the cortisol bound is CBG, cortisol binding globulin. It is the most important one. Then the next protein is transcortin, and the majority of the cortisol will bind with the albumin. Now our remaining 10% is in the free form, and this 10% is basically responsible for the physiological action. Now this high level of binding, you see there are 90% of the cortisol is in bound form, so this high percentage of the binding will leads to slow elimination, so the half-life should be increased. So half-life of cortisol is 60 to 90 minutes, and the total plasma concentration is 13.5 microgram per deciliter. Now let's focus our discussion with CBG. Now as far as the cortisol binding globulin is concerned, is basically synthesized in a liver, and its production is actually increased by estrogen. So you see where the concentration of the estrogen will rise, basically during the pregnancy. So in pregnancy the cortisol binding globulin level is high, so more amount of the cortisol will bind to the cortisol binding globulin CBG. Now in order to maintain the normal plasma level, normal concentration of the cortisol, the production of the cortisol will increase, but the amount of cortisol that is present in the free form will remain unchanged. So this is explained why the pregnancy or in pregnant woman, basically there are high percentage of the cortisol, total plasma cortisol level, without any symptom of the excess cortisol, that is Cushing's disease, that we discuss in our next lecture. So that might be asked in comment that why pregnant woman has a high total plasma cortisol level without any symptom of the glucocorticoid excess. So the answer should be these three lines. Cortisol binding globulin is synthesized in liver, its production is increased by estrogen, and during the pregnancy the estrogen level will rise, and ultimately the cortisol binding globulin level is increased, so total amount of the plasma cortisol level increase without increase in the free form of the cortisol. Now let's discuss the transport of the aldosterone. Now as far as the aldosterone is concerned, as compared to the cortisol, the bound to slight extent with the plasma protein. 60% of the aldosterone is bind to the plasma protein, and remaining 40% is in the free form. So this lesser amount of the binding will leads to fast elimination. So the half-life of the aldosterone is less than cortisol, and it is same as growth hormone, it is 20 minutes. The somatomedin, growth hormone has a half-life of 20 hours. Now the total plasma aldosterone level is about 0.006 microgram per deciliter. Now this amount is very small as compared to the cortisol. In our previous slide I mentioned that cortisol having a 13.5 microgram per deciliter. Now let's continue our discussion with the mineralocorticoids. What are the functions of the mineralocorticoids? So let's enumerate first the function and how this function will be produced by the mineralocorticoid, that we discuss next. So first enumeration of the function of the mineralocorticoid. The aldosterone will increase the reabsorption of the sodium from urine, mostly sweat, saliva and colon. So as the amount of sodium reabsorption is increased, the amount of sodium that is present in the extracellular fluid will increase. So along with the sodium, water will also be increased. So basically it expands the extracellular fluid volume, and its major effect is over the kidney. It basically regulates the three ions. First is the sodium, next one is the potassium, and finally the hydrogen, H plus ion. So what aldosterone is actually do to this three ion? The first thing, what happens to the sodium? So aldosterone basically increase the reabsorption of the sodium. Then what happens to the potassium? Aldosterone causes increased secretion of the potassium, and Same thing happens with the hydrogen, that is proton, increase secretion of the hydrogen. So by doing these three things, increase reabsorption of the sodium, increase secretion of the potassium, and increase secretion of the hydrogen, what actually aldosterone do? So it leads to what happens to the sodium? It causes the retention of the sodium. By increasing the secretion of the potassium, it is basically increase the excretion of the potassium, and by increased secretion of the H plus ion, it's basically increase the acidity of the urine. Remember the term, it is increase acidity of the urine, it is not increase in the acidity or pH of it. It does not cause acidosis inside the plasma. What aldosterone do? Aldosterone increase secretion of the hydrogen, so increase urine acidity. Now where does this mineralocorticoid will act? Where does this aldosterone acts? Let's see the site of the action of the mineralocorticoid. Let me give you a picture of the single nephron. The nephron will be look like this. The red color portion that I shown is the proximal convoluted tubule. Yellow color portion is the loop of Henle. Green color portion is distal convoluted tubule, and the sky blue is the collecting tubule. So the site of the action of the mineralocorticoid is basically over the collecting duct. Now collecting duct is very long, where actually the mineralocorticoid will work. It basically work over the very specific cell known as a principal cell. Now this principal cell will eventually causes two things: sodium reabsorption and potassium excretion. So there is one more function left, right? That is hydrogen secretion. Now in order to secrete the hydrogen, it is a additional set of the cell, that is the intercalated cell. That intercalated cell will leads to hydrogen secretion or H plus secretion. Got it? So the primary action is over the principal cell and intercalated cell. Now the effect of aldosterone over the sodium, the most important effect of the aldosterone. What aldosterone do? Aldosterone will work by increased sodium reabsorption at the P cell. P stands for principal cell. You see in this diagram, this is the portion of the collecting duct. Inside this collecting duct, this one is the tubular cell. This yellow color portion is basically the tubular fluid or the urine. This portion is the basolateral membrane near the blood. It is a basolateral membrane. This one is the luminal side or apical side. So you see there is a very specific channel that is known as the sodium channel. That sodium channel is eventually absorb the or reabsorb the sodium. Now there are very specific name to that sodium channel. That name of the sodium channel is the epithelial sodium channel, ENSC, epithelial sodium channel. So sorry, basically in absence of the aldosterone, what happens to this epithelial sodium channel? This epithelial sodium channel is degraded by a particular lytic thing that is known as NAD4-2. The name of that particular proteolytic enzyme is NAD4-2. Now what aldosterone do? Aldosterone do nothing but just inhibit this NAD4-2. So basically it increase the availability of the epithelial sodium channel over the luminal side. By using this sodium channel, epithelial sodium channel, there is one particular blocker available known as a epithelial sodium channel blocker, ENSC blocker drug. Let me give you a name of that drug. The name is the amiloride. Now what amiloride do? Amiloride basically block the sodium channel. So by blocking the sodium channel, it decrease the sodium reabsorption. So ultimately sodium will lost in the urine, and along with the sodium, water will also lost. So this amiloride is known as a diuretics. It's basically used as a diuretics. Now effect of aldosterone over the sodium is concerned, two things you need to understand. One is what happens when the aldosterone is in greater amount, and what happens when the aldosterone is in lesser amount or in deficiency of the aldosterone. So let's enumerate first. In excess aldosterone, you need to remember one particular phenomenon known as aldosterone escape. What is this aldosterone escape? We are going to discuss in our next slide. Now next thing is what happens in the deficiency of the aldosterone. So in deficiency, in broad term person will die somehow, and why the person will die, that we discuss in the next slide. So let's discuss first the aldosterone escape. What is the aldosterone escape? Now whenever there is an excess amount of the aldosterone present, it basically increase the sodium reabsorption. So what will happen once the sodium will reabsorb? It simultaneously absorb the water along with it, right? So basically there are increase in the sodium and increase in the water. So the total amount of osmolarity of the blood is not that much of the change, only slight increase in the sodium level. Why? Because not only sodium get reabsorbed, it is also absorbed the water along with it. So the actual osmolarity of the blood or the plasma or the extracellular fluid is not changed that much, and the small increase in the osmolarity will leads to hyperosmolarity. That hyperosmolarity will ultimately stimulate two things. One is the third center that is present over the hypothalamus, over the lateral hypothalamus if we become more precise, and also increase the ADH secretion. You know where the ADH secretion will lies, right? It is basically from the posterior pituitary. Now whenever the third center will stimulate, it will increase the water intake, and whenever the ADH secretion increase, this what ADH do? ADH will increase water reabsorption. So two things will happen to the water. First, person will drink more amount of water, and second thing, water will be reabsorbed from the kidney. So basically the extracellular fluid will increase much more than the sodium. So extracellular fluid will increase without much change of the sodium, right? So ultimately it will leads to increase extracellular fluid and blood volume. So basically it increase blood pressure. Now once the blood pressure will increase, that increasing blood pressure will leads two things. One is the diuresis, another one is the natriuresis, and this diuresis and natriuresis is because of the higher pressure. It is known as pressure diuresis and pressure natriuresis. Now the meaning of pressure diuresis is increased water excretion. The more amount of water get eventually filtered in the nephron, then it actually be get reabsorbed. So there are water excretion. Now whenever there is a higher amount of the pressure, increased blood pressure will leads to stretching of the atrial wall. Now this stretching of the atrial wall will ultimately release a particular hormone known as a ANP. What is ANP? Atrial natriuretic peptide, and this atrial natriuretic peptide will ultimately leads to increase excretion of the sodium. So why there is increase in excretion of the sodium? Because of the ANP. Got it? So basically now what is the scenario? We increase the water loss and we increase the sodium excretion, sodium loss. So basically return of the sodium and water to the normal level. Now instead aldosterone is there in higher amount, but because this aldosterone will ultimately leads to increase in the blood pressure, and this increase in the blood pressure will leads to increase water excretion and increase sodium excretion, and water and sodium concentration will return to the normal. So instead of aldosterone is still present, but the effect of aldosterone is not that much of effective. That is known as aldosterone escape. It is a very simple thing. Now this is all about what happens in aldosterone escape. Now let's discuss what happens in the deficiency of the aldosterone. So whenever there is a deficiency of the aldosterone, what will it will lead? It will decrease the sodium reabsorption. Just opposite to that, it decrease sodium reabsorption. So basically there are decreased sodium chloride inside the extracellular fluid. It will lead to hypoosmolar extracellular fluid. So ultimately loss of the water. So once the loss of the water will take place, it will eventually lead to decrease extracellular volume and decrease blood volume, and decreased blood volume will eventually leads to circulatory shock, and without therapy person will dies. That's why there is one comment is asked that mineralocorticoids are essential for life. See, glucocorticoids are not essential to life, which is basically responsible to fight stressful situation that we discuss in cortisol thing. But mineralocorticoids are actually essential for life. Without mineralocorticoid you die instantly within few hours, right? So all the thing you need to write it down if the such type of comment is asked. Mineralocorticoid are essential for life. All the thing here you need to mention that we discussed in our previous slide. Now effect of the aldosterone over the potassium. What is the effect of aldosterone over the potassium? Again, this is the nephron, this one is the collecting duct, this one is the segment of the collecting duct, these are the tubular cell, and this is the blood vessels, this is the basolateral membrane, this one is the luminal or the apical membrane. Now as far as the effect of aldosterone on potassium is concerned, on principal cell it will lead to increase potassium secretion. This is the particular channel that is drawn over here. Via this channel potassium will lost inside the tubular lumen. So sodium will reabsorb, potassium will be secreted by separate channels. Sodium channel is known as ENSC and this potassium channel is known as ROMK channel. Now what is ROMK channel? Basically renal outer medullary potassium channel. Let me write it down for you. Renal outer medullary potassium channel. One more channel is present over there, but I am not mentioned in this slide. The name of the channel is BK channel. It is very easy. BK means big potassium channel. It is a high conductance channel. So ultimately by increased secretion of the potassium, the level of potassium will decrease in the extracellular fluid. So what happens when there is excess amount of aldosterone present inside the circulation? There are more amount of potassium gets secreted, so leads to hypokalemia. Now what happens whenever there is a deficiency of the aldosterone? That ultimately leads to less amount of the potassium secretion and the condition is hyperkalemia. That's all for the effect of aldosterone on the potassium. Now the remaining one is the effect of aldosterone over the hydrogen ion or H+. Now again this is the cell lining of a collecting duct. This one is the principal cell, this one is the intercalated cell. I actually take the sample from the Hindu Corona. This one is the blood vessel. Very beautiful diagram is given in Hindu Corona. This one is the basolateral membrane situated near the blood. This one is the apical membrane or the luminal membrane, and over here there is a tubular fluid or the urine is present. So what happens to the hydrogen? Let's see it. Now principal cell will leads to sodium reabsorption and potassium excretion. That this cell, this is the principal cell, it will lead to sodium reabsorption via ENSC and potassium excretion via ROMK or BK channels. Now as far as the effect of aldosterone over hydrogen is concerned, we are going to discuss this cell, that is intercalated cell. Now inside the intercalated cell there are two type of, one is pump, another one is exchanger. Now this is the exchanger, it exchanges the hydrogen with the potassium, and another one is the pump, that is the potassium pump. Now aldosterone basically increase the hydrogen ATPase pump. The effect of aldosterone is more over this pump as compared to this hydrogen potassium excretion exchanger. So what aldosterone do? Aldosterone will increase the number of this pump and increase the efficiency of this hydrogen or proton pump. So basically potassium reabsorption and hydrogen secretion will take place. But as I told you, the more pronounced effect is over the hydrogen pump. So no more potassium reabsorption will occur, or no more significant potassium reabsorption will occur at the interstitial cell or intercalated cell. This is not interstitial cell, it is basically intercalated cell, pardon me. Now so excess aldosterone will ultimately leads to higher amount of the hydrogen ion will excreted, so less amount of H plus in the extracellular fluid. So what happens to the pH of the blood? pH of the blood will increase, it will lead to alkalosis, right? And that condition is known as metabolic alkalosis. Now this is all about the effect of the aldosterone. Now let's see how aldosterone do its effect, mechanism of the action. So aldosterone is basically the steroid hormone, and as I told you in our first receptor and signaling lecture that all the steroid hormone has a capacity to diffuse through the cytoplasm, diffuse to the cell membrane. So the aldosterone will diffuse inside the cell and it will bind with this receptor known as MR, mineralocorticoid receptor. Once there is aldosterone bind with the mineralocorticoid receptor, it make receptor hormone receptor complex. Once the aldosterone mineralocorticoid receptor complex occur inside the cytoplasm, it will diffuse inside the nucleus, and over the nucleus it has a DNA binding domain over the receptor actually. So once the receptor bind with the DNA binding domain, it will increase the transcription of a related protein. Which protein? That is induced by aldosterone. So the protein is known as aldosterone induced protein. So what are those protein? Those protein are first the increased production of the ENSE, epithelial sodium channel. It will increase the sodium potassium transport channel, and basically it will increase the synthesis of this ENSE. So what is the effect of this AIP, means aldosterone induced protein? It will first translocate the ENSE over the tubular lumen, over the luminal side or the apical side. It will increase formation of new epithelial sodium channel, and it also increase the efficiency of the sodium potassium transporter. Got it? Now how you are going to write it down in exam? So let's discuss it. How do you have to write it down? First thing first, aldosterone diffused to the interior of the tubular epithelial cell. Second thing is in the cytoplasm, aldosterone combined with the cytoplasmic mineralocorticoid receptor. Third thing that is take place, it aldosterone receptor complex diffuse into the nucleus and induce specific portion of the DNA to form mRNA. Now that is induced by aldosterone, that is known as aldosterone induced protein. Got it? Now aldosterone form this aldosterone induced protein. The protein are basically aldosterone stimulated protein. It has a two effect. One is the rapid effect and another one is the slower effect. Rapid effect is that it increases the activity of the epithelial sodium channel that is present over the luminal side. Second, slower effect is that it increases the synthesis of new epithelial sodium channel. And aldosterone also bind to the cell membrane and increase the activity of the sodium potassium exchanger. Okay, this is all about the mechanism of action of the aldosterone. Now regulation of the aldosterone secretion. Let's discuss the regulation part. Now as far as the regulation of the aldosterone is concerned, it is very deeply affected or very deeply intertwined with the regulation of the extracellular fluid, electrolyte concentration, blood volume, and finally blood pressure. You see, aldosterone is basically affecting the sodium concentration that is present inside the blood circulation, right? So by regulating the sodium, it is basically regulating the blood volume. So all the thing that is concerned with the blood volume will also regulated along with the aldosterone secretion, that is extracellular fluid, electrolyte concentration, blood pressure, all the thing, right? Now let's discuss the regulation thoroughly. Now as far as the control of the secretion is concerned, there are four factors will play essential role in the secretion of the aldosterone. First and most important one is the RAS mechanism, that is renin-angiotensin system. Second one is the potassium ion concentration inside the extracellular fluid, little bit of effect by sodium concentration in the extracellular fluid, and basically this ACTH. Now whenever there is increased renin-angiotensin system activity, by meaning of that is increased renin secretion, ultimately increase angiotensin 2 formation. That angiotensin 2 will eventually stimulate the adrenal cortex, basically the zona glomerulosa, and increase aldosterone secretion. It is a direct effect. Second effect is increased potassium concentration inside the extracellular fluid, is basically greatly increase aldosterone secretion. Now whenever there is increased sodium concentration in the extracellular fluid, it has a very slight effect on the aldosterone secretion. It decreases the aldosterone secretion. And the last one, as far as the ACTH is concerned, it has a very little effect on controlling the aldosterone or mineralocorticoid secretion. The ACTH has a more pronounced effect on the glucocorticoid and adrenal androgen secretion. Now how regulation of the aldosterone is related with blood volume and the blood pressure regulation. Let me give you a flow chart, a beautiful flow chart, then you guys already know it from the kidney and the CVS. You just follow the markings or number. First one, whenever there is a hemorrhage or dehydration or the sodium deficiency, that will leads to decreased blood volume. That blood volume will leads to decreased blood pressure. Whenever there is a decrease in the blood pressure, it eventually leads to stimulate the juxtaglomerular cell, and it will increase synthesis of the renin and release of the renin. Now this renin will eventually convert the angiotensinogen that is produced by liver into the angiotensin 1. Now this angiotensin 1 will approach to the lungs. Inside the lung capillary there is a very specific enzyme known as a ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. It converts into angiotensin 2. Now this angiotensin 2 has a two effect. One, it causes vasoconstriction. Another one, it will stimulate the adrenal cortex and increase production of the aldosterone. And you know what happens whenever there is increased aldosterone? It will increase sodium reabsorption, it will increase hydrogen secretion and potassium secretion. So by increasing sodium reabsorption and water reabsorption is basically increase the blood volume, and by vasoconstriction it will constrict the arteriole, and basically by these two effects blood pressure will return to the normal. So in exam, if possible, write it down this flow chart. It is not that much of difficult. Now let's discuss about the applied aspect. What happens whenever there is a higher amount of aldosterone in pathological amount? That is condition is known as hyperaldosteronism. What happens in hyperaldosteronism? That is condition is known as excess mineralocorticoid secretion. So basically there are two type of hyperaldosteronism. First is the primary, another one is the secondary. As I told you from your earlier lecture, whenever you heard the term primary, there is something wrong with that particular organ itself, right? And our endocrine organ is the adrenal cortex, and we are discussing about the aldosterone. So basically there is a wrong with zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. So that condition of primary hyperaldosteronism, the tumor of the zona glomerulosa, is known as Cohn's disease. So what is Cohn's disease? Cohn's disease is primary hyperaldosteronism. It has a decreased renin secretion, because the increase in the mineralocorticoid secretion is not via renin-angiotensin system. Rather, hyperaldosteronism, more amount of the mineralocorticoid will ultimately decrease the RAS mechanism or renin-angiotensin system, so decrease renin secretion. Now secondary hyperaldosteronism, there is a problem lies other than the gland. So basically occur due to extra adrenal cause that ultimately stimulates this renin angiotensin aldosterone in the system by nephrotic syndrome, cirrhosis of the liver and CHF. So in this condition, the second hyperaldosteronism, there is increased renin secretion. So this is the prime difference between primary and secondary hyperaldosteronism, that is the renin concentration. In primary there is decreased renin secretion, and in secondary there is increased renin secretion. Now this is all about the cause, but what actually happens in hyperaldosteronism? Whenever there is a hyperaldosteronism, there is an excess mineralocorticoid secretion, and you already know what mineralocorticoid is capable of. It leads to potassium depletion, it causes sodium retention and increase hydrogen secretion. So what sodium retention will do? Sodium retention will ultimately leads to the hypertension, increased blood pressure. It will ultimately lead to pressure diuresis, that is polyuria. So in spite of increased water and sodium, edema do not occur. This is also a very prime clinical feature of the hyperaldosteronism. Edema will not occur. And what happens whenever there is potassium depletion? It will leads to weakness of the muscle. And what happens whenever there is increased hydrogen secretion in the urine? Ultimately leads to metabolic alkalosis. It is also known as a hypokalemic alkalosis. Less amount of the potassium and more amount of the sodium along with less amount of the hydrogen. It is known as the clinical feature of the hyperaldosteronism. Now this is all about our today's lecture. Thank you.